And welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. We're talking about Pope Francis. Is he the Pope? Is he a heretic? We're going to be talking about a lot of other things, including Vigano's excommunication, joined by Dr. John Salza, who is going to go over this with us today. Dr. Salza, great to see you. How are you?
Hi, Michael. It's great to be with you again.
Good to have you on. Always an honor. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on quite a few topics related to various church controversies that are currently taking place, from the excommunication of Vigano that we saw a few months ago, all the way to people who are promoting on LifeSite News articles arguing that Pope Francis is a heretic, and therefore they conclude that he is not the Pope because they argue that a heretic can't be a Pope. So we've been seeing some interesting stuff there, and so that's kind of what I want to tackle today. Let's maybe start with Vigano. What do you think about news outlets that are supposed to be Catholic, like LifeSite News, defending guys like Vigano who have been formally excommunicated by the Catholic Church?
You might remember in my talk at Pioneer Catholic almost 2 years ago, I publicly stated that Vigano was a schismatic, and that prophecy's been fulfilled. I mean, I knew at the time that his public rejection of the Pope is intrinsically schismatic. I mean, Michael, as a cradle Catholic, this is something that we learn early on, that the man that the cardinals elect and the church accepts is the Pope. The man that the entire College of Bishops recognizes as the Pope is the Pope. And rejecting the accepted Pope is really an intrinsically schismatic act, which Francis has affirmed. That's the entire tradition of the church, because it's an attack on the unity of the church and the faith. I mean, Christ builds his church upon this rock of unity. And if people go to our website, True or False Pope, Robert Sisko and I, we cite no less than 60 theology manuals, which show us that this doctrine of universal and peaceful acceptance is not a mere theological opinion. It is actually a matter of faith. And it's not even the theology manuals that say this. This is the constant teaching of the church. And this is what you never hear places like LifeSite News and the other folks address. I mean, Martin V made this a definition of the faith. There's a document that he issued called Inter Cunctas from 1418, where he actually teaches a definition of the faith in the form of a question as opposed to a proposition. And the question is whether the reigning pope, which the person had to when coming into the church, or if he were suspected of heresy, would have to mention the reigning pope by name, the one that the entire College of Bishops recognized as Pope. He must have orally affirmed that the reigning Pope that the college has accepted is the Pope. It's a fact of divine faith. In fact, it's what is considered an infallible dogmatic fact. If you read, for example, Cardinal Ratzinger's commentary on the Professio. And so because this is a matter of divine faith, it is a mortal sin against the faith to directly deny or even doubt that Francis is the Pope. Again, let me repeat, that isn't objectively a mortal sin, because it is a definition of the faith that the man that the church has accepted as Pope, and we're principally talking about the College of Bishops, the Pope being in external communion with his college, the college being in communion with the Pope, that man is the Pope. That is a definition of the faith. It's a mortal sin to reject it. And I would also raise, the other issue, Michael, what are the consequences of that? In addition to the mortal sin, which is the worst case, there's a censure of excommunication attached to schismatic acts, right? And Vigano's excommunication, although directed at him, really serves, in my view, as a canonical warning in the external forum to those who hold the same position.
Yeah.
To the extent that they hold this same position, canon law is clear that by that act, by that schismatic act, they would also be subject to the censure of excommunication, which happens by law, ipso facto, by the fact of the schismatic act, without a declaration from the church. And so these people truly are playing fast and loose with their souls.
Yeah, very helpful. I agree. I've come to the same conclusion as you have, that this is a warning for everyone else. And so, unless there are some serious impediments that would mitigate the
Yeah.
act, I think a person has excommunicated themselves if they say that, or if they maintain that Pope Francis isn't the Pope. Yeah, and I was saying that several years ago, when I noticed that Vigano was denying Francis was the Pope. I said that with him. I said that with Altman and others. And I said, look, these guys have already excommunicated themselves, even without Rome saying anything. The fact that Rome came and said that is
Right.
just helpful for people to already know what already took place.
No, I agree. I agree with you. To be subject to canonical censure, you have to be aware, right? You have to be aware that you're doing
Right.
something contrary to the laws of the church. And that's why I'm saying this public excommunication, and it is so public, right? I mean,
Yes.
we're all connected to this. We know that, that to me, while it's not a warning directed at individuals, it still to me serves as a warning sufficient to cause grave concerns about, the person's status in the church.
Now, I want to get to this article that I saw LifeSite News post. It's called "Is Francis the Pope? The Argument from Public Heresy Suggests Not," which I thought this was interesting because we just saw John Henry Weston say not long ago, we at LifeSite News, we don't really have an official position on the question of whether Francis is the Pope or not. We just don't know whether he's the Pope, but it seems to me that they do know. It seems to me they do have an answer, because everything that they push says that Francis isn't the Pope. And here's another example. They're clearly saying in the title, "The argument from public heresy suggests that
Yeah.
Francis isn't the
Right. I
Pope."
mean, as if doubting instead of direct denying, as if doubting somehow exonerates them from culpability. I mean, heresy is
Yeah,
denial or doubt, right, of dogmas. And so
exactly.
to me to say we're not sure here about something that is infallible, right?
Yeah.
It's something that has to be assented to with defined faith. We're really not sure. You've just dug your own grave.
It's like saying we're not sure about the Immaculate Conception.
It is.
Look, this is something that you need to be sure about.
Yeah, even if it falls in category 2, unlike the Immaculate Conception would be category 1, you and I both know these are a sense of faith, of
Yes.
supernatural faith, right? So, yeah, it's a mortal sin against the faith.
Well, I want to ask you about the article. Let's start because at the beginning they talk about who is a member of the Catholic Church, and your analysis of the article. Were there any difficulties and problems with their explanation of who is a member of the Catholic Church?
This is an absolute train wreck. There's a lot I can say. Let me try to be as simple as I can. So
Sure.
first of all, Michael, and I don't know who this article is written by. It says, is it a McCuskey? I mean, it
Matthew
reads.
McCusker. I haven't heard
I
of
don't
him.
know if that's a pen name. It sounds like this was authored by a sedevacantist like John Lane
Mhm.
or Mario Dirksen. And if it is, I wish they would have the courage to come out and actually stand behind this, because they're accusing the Pope of heresy. I don't know, though. I'm speculating. But the author, he lists the 3 bonds that he says unite one to the church, and they're simply wrong. I mean, he says baptism is the first one, then he says the profession of the true faith is the second, and then subjection to the authorities is the third. That is not how the theology manuals lay them out. So the legal bonds or juridical bonds are, number 1, being baptized into and being received by lawful authority into the church. That is what forms the profession of faith. Number 2, then it's in communion with the church's sacraments, right? Subject to the bishop. And then number 3 is subject to the church's governance. And so they didn't even articulate the 3 juridical bonds correctly. I'd like to also mention there are spiritual bonds. When we talk about who's a member of the church, we want to make a distinction between spiritual bonds and the legal or juridical bonds.
Yeah.
So the spiritual bonds, that which unites us spiritually to the church are faith, hope, and charity, right? The
Mhm.
3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, all of which are necessary for salvation, absolutely necessary. The legal bonds, on the other hand, not the interior bonds, but the external bonds, is the baptism and the profession, being accepted by the church by a lawful authority, and then the communion of the sacraments and the church's governance. So there's a distinction there I want to note: interior and exterior bonds. Now, to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and this is what the article is trying to demonstrate. What makes one a member of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, as I said, is baptism and being formally accepted into the church by lawful authority. Okay, think about it. It's common sense. Any organization, has to accept you. For me becoming a Dominican, I had to be lawfully accepted into the Dominicans to say I'm a part of the Dominican family. Same with Knights of Columbus, even secular organizations, right? So to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church, one must be accepted into the church through baptism by lawful authority. And where does that start? Well, to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church, you actually must be a member of a particular church, which in the West we call a diocese, which is headed by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction who is appointed by the Pope. And so a member of a particular church, right, capital C, diocese, happens when you become a member of a parish church, small c, or a personal prelature or an oratory or something that has been approved by and in union with your local bishop. And so to the extent that one has been baptized in a Sedevacantis chapel or in the Society of St. Pius X or some other independent chapels, they have not been received by lawful authority. And hence they have not formed that juridical bond. They're not technically members of the Catholic Church. So that is very important to understand. Now, if you think about it, Michael, the authority of the bishop is the foundation of this threefold bond, you might call it. Sometimes it's called three bonds, but it's really, it's the threefold bond, which is effectively one, because you can't just have one or two. It's all or nothing. You either have all three or don't have any, because it's the authority of the bishop that kind of undergirds the entire membership in the church. When the bishop or his delegate accepts you into the church through baptism or a profession, if you've been baptized outside, you come into the Catholic Church and he accepts you, you're received by lawful authority, you then have the profession of the faith. And this goes back to all the early church fathers. Remember the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch? I mean, all 7 letters he talks about this. The bishop is in the church and the church is the bishop. The bishop is the church is the bishop. So the point here is, to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church, you have to be accepted by lawful authority of a particular church that's in union with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that is a background. Here is where the LifeSite News article errs. They equate profession of the true faith with someone's oral articulation of doctrine. Okay? They don't equate it to what I've just explained it to be, the lawful reception by you into the church, you maintaining external communion with the church. And think about this. I mean, I can prove this very easily, that someone's oral profession, all right, does not create the juridical reality. How can you prove that? It's very simple. What happens when a Protestant wants to come into the Catholic Church? The Protestant may say, you know what? I've come to believe in Catholicism. I started attending, the Mass. I want to be a Catholic. I'm a Catholic, right? Does that make that Protestant a member of the Roman Catholic Church? No. His oral profession, he's on his way, right? He's on his way, but his oral profession by itself doesn't create the juridical bond. It's the same thing, Michael, with a Catholic's oral profession of doctrine, of heresy. The oral profession by itself doesn't sever the juridical bond. And this is because the doctrines, that are being professed, they concern the material element of communion. But external submission to the teaching authority of the church is actually the formal element. So if somebody is uttering heresies, but there's still an external communion with the church, they still say, yeah, the Roman Catholic Church is my rule of faith. It's not sola scriptura. It's not the Westminster Confession. It doesn't matter if they're orally articulating heresy. That by itself does not sever the juridical bond. And hence, the profession of faith, which LifeSite News is referring to, has nothing to do with one's oral profession of faith or one's understanding of the faith or one's teaching or practice. It doesn't. It simply has to do with having been accepted into the church. And that bond, I'll kind of finish off this section this way, that bond, that juridical threefold bond that is formed by being accepted into the church, is not severed unless one either openly departs from the church, which would be considered public defection, a notorious act of public defection, or is formally cut off by the church's judgment. In other words, Michael, it requires notorious heresy to sever the juridical bond. We'll talk about this, what this means. It's not public heresy per se. It's notorious heresy, which is heresy that the Catholic Church legally recognizes as sufficing for the crime of heresy. I mean, if you think about it, my status as a Catholic in the church is a legal status. I have a baptismal certificate that's filed, with the diocese. It takes a legal act or a legal adjudication, either through a declaration or an act that is acknowledged by legal authority, to formally sever that bond. That's why these guys at LifeSite News are so off on this. It's hard to believe they could even publish this kind of article.
They're not making the necessary distinctions between perhaps a public heretic and a notorious heretic.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I mean, the train wreck is and how they even describe the categories of heretics, and I think we'll get into that somewhat later. But yeah.
So, I mean, they assert that public heretics can never be members of the church. So, can you comment on that? Is that accurate?
That is imprecise terminology, because public heresy and public heretic really are not proper, valid legal distinctions. The proper legal distinctions are either occult heresy or notorious heresy. When you read the theology manuals, and I'm talking, we've poured through scores, maybe well over 100. When the theologians say public heretic or manifest heretic, remember Robert Bellarmine usually used the term manifest heretic, they are referring to a notorious heretic who is a public non-Catholic, someone that they have no external communion with the Catholic Church. A Protestant, for example, would be a notorious heretic. One who's publicly defected would be a notorious heretic. So again, the distinctions are either notorious, which is a public non-Catholic, a Protestant, a sedevacantist, for example, an old Catholic, for example. Those are public non-Catholics. Whereas an occult heretic is someone who has committed the sin of heresy and in fact may even have externalized his heresy publicly, but the church has not yet recognized the person as a notorious heretic. So that is a very important point. When we see, for example, Pope Pius the 12th, referring to public heretics, Robert Bellarmine's a great example in his fifth opinion, referring to manifest heretics. Look at who he's referring to. He's referring to the Arians, the Novatians, the Pelagians. I mean, I could throw in the sedevacantists and the independent trads who reject their bishops. Those are the people who would be considered notorious heretics. And Pius XII, addresses that in Mystici Corporis Christi. He says that only those who either openly depart from the church and effectively join another religion, or at least publicly reject the magisterium as the rule of faith, or are cut off by the church's judgment, would be considered notorious. If not, and you remain in external communion, even if you don't go to mass, even if you're professing heresies, even if you're a horrible Catholic, so long as you're in external communion, you might be a bad Catholic. You may even be in a state of mortal sin, but you are still a member of the Roman Catholic Church. It's a juridical institution. It's a hierarchical, visible society. These things are visible. And I want to just mention one other point, Michael, because the LifeSite News article also conflates membership with holding office in the church. This is another mistake. There is a distinction. I mean, the theologians have debated about what actually constitutes membership in the Catholic Church. There were some theologians like Suarez, for example, and to some extent Garrigou-Lagrange, where they thought you needed the interior virtue of faith, the actual theological virtue, to be a member. Bellarmine didn't think so, but then they make a distinction between, are you a true member or an apparent member? I mean, there's various debates about this, but none of the theologians ever held that the virtue of faith was necessary for holding office You see? So there is a distinction there. I mean, the Pope or a bishop could be in a state of mortal sin. He could have lost the interior virtue of faith, but that has no bearing upon whether he's lost his office, because as long as he remains in external communion and has title, he would hold his office and jurisdiction. And finally, I would close by saying another thing that LifeSite didn't address is canon law says for a cleric to lose his office, it must be what? It must be declared by the church.
Okay.
In 194 sub 2. And so for all these reasons, I mean, we'll continue to talk about this, but for all these reasons, the LifeSite News article really has done a very poor job in explaining what constitutes membership in the church. And I would say that because they have erred on understanding what the profession of faith means, they have ended with a false ecclesiology, by failing to understand what the Roman Catholic Church actually is. That's the root error.
So talking about the profession of faith specifically, they argue that Pope Pius XII said that members of the Catholic Church must profess the true faith. Is that accurate?
Well, he says that, but what does he mean by that? I think you might be referring to number 23. And Michael, we've addressed this in great detail on our website and also in our book, True or False Pope, which has been out for some years right now. First of all, Pius XII and Mystici is not addressing the issue of holding office or loss of jurisdiction. So let's remember that, okay? The document can't be used to address that particular issue. It's separate and distinct. But when Pius XII refers to the profession of the faith, he is referring in his own words to the juridical bond. That's the word he uses. And what does he mean by that? Well, he actually interprets what he means by, if you go to the next paragraph and you read, I think it's paragraph 24, he's citing Augustine in the context of the profession of the true faith and the juridical bond. And the quote that Pope Pius XII puts from Augustine is where Augustine says, quote, "It's better for them to be cured within the community than to be cut off." Do you know who Augustine is referring to in that particular quote? I'm not putting you on the spot. It's more of a rhetorical question.
Offhand, I don't.
Yeah,
I remember reading this in True or False Pope a while back, but it's been so long.
He's referring to the Pelagians.
I was going to say the Donatists, so I was going to get it wrong.
Close. Yeah. Yeah. If you go look up St. Augustine's quote, he's referring to the Pelagians who were publicly professing heresy. Now, nobody's going to dispute that, right? And they were condemned I think, a couple of years later. And Pius XII is talking about the profession being a juridical bond of those who still have external communion with the church, even though they're professing heresy. Yeah. Okay. That's what Pius XII is talking about here. And again, as St. Augustine says, it's better for them to be cured within the church than to be cut off, because once they were cut off, and they were cut off a couple of years later, as I recall historically, what happens? You're outside the church. What kind of grace is available for you then for conversion? You see, so that's what Pius XII was really referring to there. He's interpreting the profession of faith exactly the way that all the theology manuals do, and the way that I've explained it.
Okay, that's very helpful. So also in reference to Pope Pius XII, they argue that he says the sin of heresy severs one from the body. I suspect the body of Christ. So does that somehow disprove what you've been arguing here so far?
No, it doesn't, because the Latin doesn't say the sin of heresy. It does not say peccatum. It says admissum. And I think there's a reason why Pius XII was very nuanced and intentionally chose admissum, because while it could mean sin, it actually means offense. And in this context, actually refers to the crime of heresy.
The crime.
Right. And, Michael, I think we know that because the sin of heresy by itself does not sever one from the body.
Right.
Okay. Right.
Can you imagine? I mean, can you imagine? We would never know who a bishop actually is, right? If they just
you have a heretical
privately sinned, with embracing a heresy, you wouldn't know if they're still a bishop or not,
Unless you have a heretical ecclesiology like the false traditionalists do.
Right.
They do think that everybody in the true church is spiritually united through an oral profession of the faith. But, as you well know, we know that an occult heretic is not severed from the body,
All right.
right? So
Right.
Pius XII cannot be referring to the sin of
Right.
heresy, which is what the Sedevacantists have been saying for the last 50 years. No, it must be the crime of heresy, because only the legal infraction can sever the legal bond, while the spiritual infraction severs the spiritual bond.
That's very helpful. So they're not making this important distinction. The Latin would seem to suggest that he's referring to the crime as opposed to just the sin or the act of heresy. Yeah,
Correct.
I don't suspect that a lot of people know that there is a distinction between the crime of heresy and the sin of heresy.
Very important distinction. And I think we'll get into that when we talk about the categories of heretics, which are incorrectly explained in this article. But the sin of heresy is one who is culpable, right? Who is culpable for his grossest deviation from the Catholic faith, from Catholic dogma. He would commit a sin. But even if that deviation, Michael, is externalized publicly, again, it still remains occult
Yeah,
until the church legally recognizes it as notorious. And
that's
that happens
helpful.
with, like Vigano, either a declared excommunication, or I would maintain one who has openly departed from the magisterium by rejecting the Pope and the bishops in union with him. That would be sufficient. In other words, when we say there's a distinction, I might want to mention notorious by fact versus notorious by law. While it all relates to law, generally, if there's a declared act of schism and hence a declared excommunication, we would say that person is notorious by law.
Mhm.
If one publicly defects from the church by rejecting the Pope, for example, we would say that is a notoriety by fact. Why? Because the church would not have to do any further investigation in order to issue a declaration immediately based upon the act. The church has sufficient evidence, testimony, facts to issue a declaration without any further investigation. That's what it means by notorious by fact.
Okay. Now, they also argue that Leo the 13th in Satis Cognitum argues or claims that receding in the least degree from a dogma puts one outside of communion with the Catholic Church. I see this brought up pretty often.
Yeah.
This is why I agree with you. I kind of feel like the author is parroting a lot of those common set of Acontis arguments that we've seen from some of the other figures you mentioned at the beginning of the stream there.
This is one of the oldest ones, and we've beaten this to death. Look, you got to read the context. This is what will clarify the matter for you. Okay, read the preceding paragraph 9. What Leo is referring to is notorious heretics who were what? Declared heretics by the church.
Mm-hmm.
This is who Leo, they take this completely out of context and act like it's some super dogma on its own. No, Leo is talking about all of the heretics that the church has declared to be heretics, and he even mentions them in paragraph 9. He mentions the Arians, he mentions the Novatians and others. And so what Leo the 13th is doing here is he's saying that in this statement, he's explaining that one can be declared a heretic by the church for denying just one dogma. You see? So that's how these guys cherry pick these verses. He's simply saying you only have to recede from one degree of dogma to be eligible for being declared a heretic, which is what the church did with some of these other groups. And so this has nothing to do with the position that somebody secretly falls into heresy and loses office. No, he's referring to notorious heretics. Okay, a notorious heretic is a notorious heretic who recedes only from one dogma and is declared as such by the church. That's what he's talking about. And it's interesting, Michael, in the next paragraph 10, you can go on to read that. Pope Leo says that being united to the church in government is a matter of de jure divino, of divine law.
Mm-hmm.
That is powerful. We've been saying this for years, that it is a matter not of ecclesiastical or human law that you have
Right.
to be
Right.
subject to your bishop. This isn't some lawyer trying to make things up and make it all legal. No, 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 no. This is the divine law of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, that one must be subject to those whom the Holy Ghost appointed over us to rule and govern the church, right? In Acts 20, 28, as I recall. So it is a matter of divine law. You remember what I said at the beginning of the church, entering into the church by being received by lawful authority and then in subjection to that authority. That's a matter of divine law. Mm-hmm. Leo XIII affirms the longstanding tradition of the church right here. And that's because, Michael, this is, again, is one of the parts of the threefold juridical bond, being in subjection to the divine governance of the church. When one is separated from the divine governance of the church, which the Society of St. Pius X is, all of the Sedevacantists are, the resistance to the resistance, the independents, and whatever other name they give themselves, because they are not subject to the divine governance of the church, they're not in hierarchical communion or subject to a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, they are not members of the Roman Catholic Church. They don't share any of the threefold bond of unity with the church.
They have a section here on the 4 types of heretic or heretics. Let me share it on my screen and get you to comment on these. They have formal heretics, material heretics, occult heretics, and then public heretics. Can you comment on how accurate this actually is?
Yeah, there are a lot of errors in this presentation, and it shows that the author really does not have a deep understanding of these issues and doesn't make any proper distinctions. I mean, he seems to just have cobbled terms together. As I said, the proper distinction is either occult or notorious, okay, or formal versus material. Why don't we go through these, Michael? I'll go through them one by one, and then if you have any questions or comments.
Do you need me to pull them back up?
Sure, yeah. Okay. What was the first one? So was it formal?
The first one's formal heretic.
Formal public heretic. Okay. So he says that it was openly and guilty refuses submission to the rule of faith. Okay. This is not a proper legal or theological category. All right. First, like I said before, the correct term is not public, but rather notorious. Okay. A notorious heretic, which is a public non-Catholic. That means the person either was never a Catholic, or he publicly defected, or he was cut off by the church's judgment. And the reason why I say that we don't use the term formal here is because heresy, or public, because heresy can be public but still occult. You see? Mm-hmm. So that's the first error with this classification. The second error I would say is we don't qualify this as formal, because that concerns the internal forum, and notorious heresy only concerns the external forum, right? So I see 2 problems with using formal public heretic. The correct term is not public, it's notorious, and the formal element, or the element of the will, is not really relevant, because that is a matter of the internal forum and does not concern, this concerns a public or notorious heretic, only concerns the external form. So that's what I would say about that category.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the second one, material heretics, are those who labor under invincible ignorance about the same church and in good faith choose a different rule to guide them.
Yeah. If you're talking about material public heretic, it looks like that's their second category. So it's not necessary to qualify a material heretic as public, because a material heretic is a public heretic. Okay. So that, again, it shows me that the author doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's very confused. A material heretic is a public non-Catholic who is not culpable for his separation from the church. That's what it is. So we don't call them material public heretics because they're necessarily public. Again, a material heretic is a public non-Catholic who is not culpable for separation. He's invincibly ignorant. And that's why Catholics really can never be material heretics, because even if they're professing, like I said, errors concerning the material element of the profession of faith, the individual doctrines, so long as they remain in external communion, they preserve the formal element of the profession of faith, which is submission to the church's teaching authority, right? And we should mention, that comes to mind, a heretic is a heretic primarily not because of the individual errors that they profess, but it's primarily because they reject the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church. That's the formal aspect of being a heretic. The material aspect deals with the doctrine, but it's that formal aspect which severs your juridical bond of the profession of faith, because it severs, you're no longer in submission to the authority that originally received you into the church. You're severing that bond and saying, I'm going to choose another rule of faith. So, traditionally anyway, and I know people can use these terms a little bit differently, but at least the way, that I've studied over the last 30 years or so, we don't call Catholics material heretics. So again, to the extent the author is applying this term to those who are in external communion with the church, he would be wrong on that point.
Okay. He claims that he's getting them from Cardinal Bio. Do you recall if Cardinal Bio used these terms like this?
No, Cardinal Bio was very clear, notorious versus occult. And remember what I said, when many of the theologians use the term public or manifest heretic, they are referring to notorious heretic or notorious heresy. In fact, Cardinal Bio is one of the best examples we used in our book, True or False Pope, because it was Bio who said that even if the heresy is externalized publicly, it remains a cult unless the church recognizes it as notorious. Now, he's not the only one that said that, but since you mentioned Bio, I can push back and say, and I think somewhere in this article, Michael, they actually admit that notorious heresy or occult heresy could still be externalized publicly. But it's interesting. It's interesting that they bring Bio up because he's supporting everything I'm saying.
Now he has two more: occult heretics and public heretics.
Yeah, so it looks
but
like
you've noted that this is actually subsumed underneath the other one. Public heretics is subsumed or assumed under occult heretics.
If you go down, I think in the article, if you keep going down, the third one I see in my article, the third one is formal occult heretic. Okay, so we did address the first two, formal public heretic and material public heretic. Now let's talk about formal occult heretic. So there are two errors in this classification as well. The first is occult heresy is always formal. So you don't need to qualify it as formal. Okay. And that's why it shows me that this guy doesn't know really, he doesn't have a deep understanding of these issues. Sure. So occult heresy is always formal heresy. The occult heretic is culpable for his deviation from the sin.
He's not doing this unintentionally.
Correct. It's a mortal sin. And so with the mortal sin of heresy, he severs, remember I said, the spiritual bonds, right? So occult heresy is always formal. It's a mortal sin which severs the spiritual bond, but not the juridical bond. Not the juridical bond because it remains occult, all right? So that's the first point there. The second point I would say is that this author violates his own definition, since he admitted that an occult heretic also includes those who manifest heresy by external signs. He does refer to Bio's quote on that. And here he limits heresy to secret heresy, right? So which one is it? He's contradicting himself. Occult heresy is not limited to what he says secret heresy. It's not. And he admits it elsewhere. You see how confused he is. Yeah. So the occult heresy can be secret, okay, but it also can be externalized, and it remains occult until the church recognizes it as notorious.
Okay. That's helpful. Yeah. So let's go to the next issue here with the article.
There's one more, isn't there, Michael?
Well, I think we got all four, but if you had another one that you wanted to cover, go ahead.
I saw him also saying, let me see if I got this right. The third one I saw was formal occult heretic.
Oh, yes,
I
yes,
see
yes.
material occult heretic then as the fourth category.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Let me pull that back up on the screen here. Right. So formal public heretics, material public heretics,
Yeah.
formal occult heretics, and then material occult
Okay. And
heretics
he says what? He says, who secretly
who
innocent
secretly
refuse
and
submission.
innocently refuse submission to
All
the
right.
rule of faith proposed by the
Yeah.
magisterium.
So this is a totally false category as well. There's no such
Mhm,
thing as a material occult heretic. Okay.
mhm,
Number one, a material heretic, as I said, is a public non-Catholic who's
mhm,
invincibly ignorant. So it's not a cult. That's what a material heretic is. Secondly, a cult heretic is a formal heretic,
mhm.
not a material heretic. He's a formal heretic who has committed the sin of heresy, and hence it's not material. So, in charity, I have to say that this author is completely wrong. And let me just leave it at that. I think I've proven the point, and it really shows, and it gives me some righteous anger because we're talking about the Vicar of Christ here, and it
Sure.
shows how unread and unsophisticated these false traditionalists are. They seem to make up the rules as they go along. They accuse the Novus Ordo folks of not being properly catechized, but they're the ones that aren't catechized. And here we have LifeSite News and John Henry Weston, who, shame on him if he actually reviewed this article because he doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. They
Mm.
accuse the Vicar of Christ of being a heretic, but they don't even know what heresy is. And they don't know how to properly categorize the necessary distinctions. So I'll get off the soapbox, but it gets me a little bit angry.
Oh, believe me, I could totally understand. I feel the same way. So before we touch on that specifically about Pope Francis being a heretic, they do claim that if the Pope falls into heresy, he's no longer the Pope. We hear that all the time from Sedevacantists. Can you show us why that's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, if it means that the Pope has taught heresy publicly or even loses the virtue of faith, of course, it's dead wrong. And there's many things we can say. We wrote an 800-page book showing it's wrong, but I'll try to boil it down to a couple points
Yeah,
that come to mind.
sure.
This is something that I haven't seen even addressed. Pope Martin V, the same Pope who effectively defined universal and peaceful acceptance as a matter of
Hmm.
faith. Pope Martin V, Michael, in a document called Inevitanda Scandala at the Council of Constance, declared that a heretic must be denounced by the church before he loses jurisdiction. Okay.
Mm. Okay,
Again,
that wasn't.
this
Oh.
is all the fathers. This is Constantinople IV. And in fact, there was a great theologian named Father Paul Lehmann who in 1621, right, sometime after the Council of Trent, wrote that even a notorious heretic, that is, even one whom the church recognizes as a notorious heretic, perhaps because they have warned him and he remains, in his contumacy. Father Paul Lehmann says that heretic pope would still retain his jurisdiction so long as he continued to be tolerated by the church. And that's consistent with what Martin V said, what other theologians have said, until and unless there is a public denunciation or declaration. So long as the Pope remains in external communion with the church, with the College of Bishops, and the College of Bishops remain in communion with him, he retains his jurisdiction. And of course, that's the case because the church is a visible society. And as Bellarmine said, we have a right to infallibly know who our pastors are. We have a right to know who the Pope is and who the bishops are. And that's why there has to be a legal process, right, for them to be removed from office.
That makes
And,
sense.
I should maybe just mention also, they talk about the Pope losing office. Well, that's a different issue than I said, how one becomes a member and remains a member in the church. But there were so many opinions on this question, right? And you're aware of this. We've talked about this on other shows, but just as kind of a refresher for your viewership, there are many opinions on how a pope who committed the crime of heresy would lose his office, if he even would. This is all speculation, right? We know that there's a consensus that the Pope would have to be provided ecclesiastical warnings from the cardinals, and not just dubia from the cardinals, and not just filial corrections written by priests and laymen, which do not have any ecclesiastical authority whatsoever, such as, the filial correction that was issued against Francis on Amoris Laetitia. But there has to be warnings, presumably from the cardinals.
Mm-hmm.
There would have to be some type of what is often called an imperfect counsel, right?
Yeah.
Where the church would exercise what is called a discretionary judgment in establishing the elements of the crime. As you well know, Michael, this whole issue is, how do we judge the Pope when the Pope has no judge on earth, right? That's really what's kind of the driving factor behind all these opinions. That's why Bellarmine said, that the church isn't really judging the Pope, but only the facts. And once the facts are established, is there a declaration that's issued? Does the Pope? There's all kinds of opinions about this. And the point I'm trying to make is, these amateur theologians jump to the conclusion that Francis has lost the office for heresy. The church hasn't even told us how that would happen. I mean, the church hasn't even given us a roadmap for how that would happen. And so you see how rash that kind of judgment is. It's a judgment by usurpation, as St. Thomas would call it, because we're making a judgment about things over which we don't have any competence or authority to judge.
I want to ask you about probably the most important question here for the topic at hand. Is Francis actually a heretic? I hear so many people just simply assert he is a heretic, but I've never seen it actually proven. What are your thoughts here?
I agree with you 100%. It hasn't been proven. And as I've stated, and as I've provided in the short hour we have, proof that even if Francis, and I don't concede this at all because it has not been proven to me, even if Francis were to have uttered heretical statements, that does not sever his bond with the church. It doesn't sever the juridical bond, because he remains in external communion with the College of Bishops. And as Father Paul Lehmann said, so long as he is tolerated by the Pope, he retains his jurisdiction. Of course not. Of course he's not a heretic. I mean, if you even read, and this is not just LifeSite's approach, but anybody who's accusing Francis, they usually don't even quote Francis's words. Have you noticed that? I mean, this article is quoting the filial correction. Is from what I can tell, they're not even quoting Francis directly, right? So how does that work? No, like I said, so long as the Pope remains in external communion with his church and he's recognized by the College of Bishops, he's still Pope with universal jurisdiction over the church. And let's remind our viewers, it's a matter of the faith, that the college and the church, moral unanimity, right? There might be some outliers, some oddballs. There have always been oddballs in the church, people. There always have been. But you have to look to the college and the papacy. Though that's the divine institution that our Lord Jesus Christ set up. When we say the church is visible, we know that there's a papacy and a college. The Pope is the head of that college. And so long as the Pope is in union with the college and the college is in union with the Pope and they recognize each other as lawfully holding office, of course, there is no other option. You may not like him, but I'll tell you what, instead of accusing him of heresy every day, you should be doubling down on your prayers for this man, because he is the vicar of Christ, like it or not. And I've always said there is an intimate union, between Christ and the vicar of Christ that surpasses our understanding. And, we should be really concerned about, making judgments about something that is totally outside our competence.
That's a really good point. Now, I want to get to these chat questions, but I'm curious, what was the name of that Martin V document, Scandala?
In Evitata Scandala, 1418. You can look that one up. But I think the other one I mentioned on the universal peaceful acceptance was Inter Cuctas. And they were all right at the end of the Council of Constance. And we probably have a lot of the material on True or False Pope.
On the website, True or False Pope. Okay, that's where I was going to look for it, because that builds on, as you noted, Constantinople 4 and Canon 21. And so that's an interesting point that I need to look into. I wasn't aware that he had said that.
Yeah, I know you're aware of Cardinal Ratzinger's commentary on the Professio, right, where he
Oh yeah,
quotes
yeah,
the
absolutely.
acceptance of the Pope as an infallible
Yes,
dogmatic fact,
yes,
right? I mean,
yes.
that's pretty strong.
Yes, yes. Yeah, he puts that in the category 2.
He
Yeah.
does. Yeah.
Yeah, I just finished a lecture on that for my magisterium course,
Awesome.
because that's kind of the basis for a lot of the lessons is the commentary on the Professio Fidei, because there's just so much there, you know?
There's so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish he would have explained even more of it, but
Hmm.
like we
Agreed.
know that Professio is a matter of faith. We must assent, with faith to the four corners of that document. And
Yes.
that's why this is such a grave matter. For Catholics to even be calling into question
Hmm.
the legitimacy of Francis is really tough.
You know what he also says that's interesting in that commentary?
What's that?
He says that a person who denies a secondary object impairs their communion with the Catholic Church. So it impairs their full communion. In other words, they no longer have full communion with the Catholic Church.
He does say that. And to be even more specific, why is that? Because rejecting the Pope is intrinsically schismatic.
Mhm.
And therefore, if you reject the Pope, you are severing your threefold juridical bond, right? Think about that. I mean, how can I be in union with my bishop if I reject the Pope, since my bishop is in union with the Pope? You see, so it is an intrinsically schismatic act that severs the juridical bonds.
Mm.
And that's why, Cardinal Ratzinger says, as you rightly pointed out, Michael, I don't know how he puts it in the Latin, but it's some like sever communion, or it renders you less than full communion, something to that
Mhm.
effect.
There's this I forget what meeting it was. Vallombrosa, I think is the name of it. It was a place in California. There was a meeting there with the some of the people from the CDF and some of the bishops for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops a while back. And in this document that they had there, they discussed for those who reject secondary objects, can they be given communion, Holy Communion? And they still say yes, which I think this is odd, because if they're no longer in full communion, the practice should reflect that, and they shouldn't be given communion.
I would agree. And what they probably reasoned is that even though rejecting a secondary object of the faith is a mortal sin, it remains a matter of the internal forum unless it is notorious, unless
Uh-huh.
the church legally recognizes it as such, in which case then there would be an external impediment to communion and barring from the sacrament. So I'm guessing that's how they dealt with it. But I'll tell you what, if there's risk of mortal sin, that should be sufficient for anybody to completely
Yeah.
change positions and go to confession,
Yeah.
and go to a confessor that has the faculty to lift censures, because you may have incurred the censure of excommunication. I would
Mhm.
urge people listening to this podcast to get a confessor who has the faculty to lift canonical censures,
Mhm.
because you may have incurred the censure.
And how do they know who does and doesn't have that faculty? They just need to
You
ask
go to
them.
the diocese, because I'm aware of diocesan priests who either have or don't have that faculty. But my understanding is it might be given in some dioceses as part of the faculty to hear
Yeah, it's
confession,
all
but
pretty.
I'm aware of in other dioceses it is not necessarily the case. Sometimes you hear, and I've heard in the Latin, when the absolution is in Latin, some priests mention they're lifting the censures and others
Yes.
don't, right? Which
Yes.
tells me that they may or may not have
Yeah.
it. So you just want to be sure.
Sure, sure. That's a good point. Now there are some questions here in the chat if you have a few moments.
Sure.
From Matthew, can we judge the Pope's magisterium? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
I'm not sure what he means about judging the
Well, I
magisterium.
suppose, yeah, I think what he's probably referring to is, can you say, hey, you know what, the Pope is wrong on that teaching, judging his teachings and saying, no, he's wrong on that.
I would say, to the extent that something that the Pope presents, which is outside the scope or sphere of his authority, we can. If the Pope is talking about ecology and saving energy on air conditionings, I think we can, that opens up, potential, remarks there.
Sure.
if it's a matter of the faith, even, as you know, Michael, even category 3 truths, and they're called doctrinal truths,
Right.
which haven't been either revealed as as divinely revealed or held or to be definitively held, still require the assent of intellect and will, right? So there's this docility and submission to the magisterium, and hence Christ says, "Hear the church." He doesn't say, "Judge the church."
And what is your take on the deposition of Pope Silverius?
I'd have to get familiar with the facts. I
I don't
don't
recall that one specifically either. Was this one who was deposed by the emperor, most likely?
Yeah, I think it may have been. I mean, in many cases, I'll say this: in many cases where the popes have been deposed,
Mm-hmm.
okay, the popes have submitted to the discretionary judgment of imperfect councils, and even through their submission to a discretionary judgment and a subsequent deposition, it's still as a matter of divine law, the council does not exercise any authority over the pope. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so even in the historical cases, Marcellinus comes to mind, where he engaged in an act of false worship. He submitted to the discretionary judgment of the council there, and he repented and said, the council said, "You have judged yourself." So in cases where popes have been deposed, they usually have submitted. Now, Bellarmine says there can be a case where an imperfect council can be called to judge and convict a pope of heresy against his will. And that is after ecclesiastical warnings are issued to the pope and he remains hardened in his heresy, hardened in his contumacy. Bellarmine says the church has a right to provide for its head. So there are cases that Bellarmine and others acknowledge where even a judgment could be rendered against the Pope's will. But again, these are not direct judgments on the Vicar of Christ. It's only the church exercising her right to judge the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And then Christ comes in, and it's Jesus Christ who actually severs the bond, not the church. And we talk about Jesuit opinion, Bellarmine opinion. All the opinions are pretty consistent on that. Church doesn't have any authority to sever the bond. The church only has the authority to declare that this pope is hardened in his heresy. He should be avoided. Christ then acts with the church, severs the bond, and then the church can come and depose. So in Silverius, I don't remember specifically the case, but it might have been a case where he submitted to a discretionary judgment and submitted to the authority, but he wasn't legally bound to unless the church convicted him and found him guilty of heresy.
Here's a question, and I actually have my own that I want to throw in with this. Is it fair to say that former Archbishop Lefebvre is really no different from former Archbishop Vigano is really no different than Marcel Lefebvre in their approach to rejecting papal authority and embracing schism Lefebvre 2.0? Well, my twist to that would be, is it that the case that it could actually be that Vigano is really carrying out the work of Lefebvre, because in my estimation, towards the end of Lefebvre's life, it really looks like he may have embraced sedevacantism. They're saying that he no longer said the name of the Pope, and he was saying things that would necessarily lead one to conclude that he was a sedevacantist.
Interesting, Michael, because Father Cicada, may he rest in peace, said the very same thing. In fact, he put out a video before he died that he said, "We got the idea of sedevacantism from Archbishop Lefebvre." This is what he said. And so Lefebvre may have held that, at least privately, without being public about it. I mean, Cicada's on record of saying he's never mentioned the Pope in the canon of his Mass ever since his ordination Mass. And that had to come from somewhere. That came from the milieu of the Society of St. Pius X. Are they the same? Certainly the spirit is the same. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, Lefebvre's a lot worse because he has set up marriage tribunals and seminaries and chapels and the rest of it throughout the world against the will of all the bishops of the world. But on the other hand, Vigano's worse because he has publicly rejected the Vicar of Christ, not just privately. But I think it's one of the same, because like you said, if you read what Lefebvre wrote, and he lived to 91, but I'm talking about even what Lefebvre wrote in the 70s. He said, these popes are antichrists. Rome has defected. This is no longer the Roman Catholic Church, but a new conciliar modernist church.
Yeah.
So we are dealing with the spirit of schism and heresy for both men, in my view.
Barons asks, would those that hold that the Novus Ordo is illicit, are they in schism?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say the material elements of schism are there because you're rejecting. Remember when I talked about the second juridical bond, or part of the threefold bond, being in communion with the sacraments? If you're rejecting the Novus Ordo as an illicit rite, you are rejecting the worship of 99.9% of the Roman Rite, or the Western Church. So how is that not schismatic? Certainly that would be a schismatic act or movement or idea or doctrine. And boy, like I said, you got to be careful, because you could be subject to censures for holding that, especially if you're publicizing it.
Now, Chris asks, what happens if a pope commits a serious sexual crime? Would he be removed?
Well, would he be removed? First of all, a sexual crime does not impair or sever or compromise his juridical bonds to the church. Okay, he still remains in external communion. He's just, a sexual deviant who's guilty of a crime. It's no like then, if he joined the mafia, or if he robbed a bank, or if he committed some, great grievous sin or crime. So I don't, would he be removed? And remember, the Pope has no judge on earth but God alone. Even in the theoretical case where a Pope would be judged as a heretic, those judgments are not directly on the Pope, but only on the material and formal elements. And then it's Christ who comes in and works with the church. So would he be removed for sexual crime? No. I mean, again, the Pope, as long as he's tolerated by the church, even if he's a public heretic, and in layman's words, a notorious heretic, he retains his jurisdiction. So I don't see, a sexual crime having anything to do with the juridical bond.
Very helpful. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. I think I got everything there. I just see mostly comments. Oh, wait, no, there was one that we missed. Here it is. What can I do if I face an anti-Catholic family who thinks that Pope Francis is a far left liberal?
Well, I would say he does hold some liberal views. But still, I owe him my allegiance and fidelity as the vicar of Christ on earth. If I'm going to be a Roman Catholic and truly believe that not only is there no salvation outside the church, but that means every human creature must be subject to the Roman pontiff. That's where I want to be, so, and we deal with anti-Catholic people all the time. They can call them a liberal, but look, what I'd say is, yeah, but you still must be in subjection to him as a matter of salvation, like him or not. It's not that we accept every off-the-cuff record or statement a pope makes. That's not what the church requires of us. The church only requires us to be in union with our bishop, the bishops who are in union with the pope, to follow those truths that we are required to believe, either through faith or through assenting to the docility of the magisterium. To the extent that bishops say something that's outside the scope of their authority, then we don't have to follow it. But so let's understand those distinctions. But let's stand up for the Pope. It's about time, that and I'm so glad you had Father Imberato on, because now we have this good and holy priest who has recognized these traditional errors, and we're looking forward to him working in the vineyard with us, because he has some great points to say, and I'm hoping to collaborate with him in the future.
Yeah, that will be awesome. This is a curious one. Does the distinction between passive and active election of the Pope for cardinals mean an excommunicated heretic could be elected Pope?
Sure, an excommunicated heretic could be elected the Pope, so long as he's elected and accepted by the Church. As all of the theologians see, any canonical defects, including ecclesiastical impediments, are healed in the root. As long as he's accepted, the acceptance is an infallible sign that all the conditions for him necessary to be Pope have been met. So that could happen. right? It doesn't serve as an impediment, just like some of these bishops, who came into the church. Cardinal Manning is one, Cardinal Newman is another one. They were public heretics. We use the word public. They were notorious heretics who entered into the church, later after they converted. So, those impediments would not impede a heretic from being elected pope. He's a member of the church, and if he's accepted by the church as such, then he's pope.
Mahoville said, would calling for an exorcism of Vatican I, as some pseudo-trads like Dr. Kwasniewski call for, would that constitute heresy?
Exorcism of Vatican I. I'm not sure what they mean by that. Do you know what that means?
I think it might be a play off of we need a spirit of an exorcism of the spirit of Vatican II. Well, they're saying that they need a spirit for the an exorcism for the spirit of Vatican I.
No, I think we actually need an exorcism for the spirit of the false traditionalist movement, who don't understand what heresy is. They don't understand what category 1 or 2 truths are, and they really don't understand what the Roman Catholic Church is. We need an exorcism for them.
Why is the Pope so severe with trad bishops and so permissive with progressive ones? Any thoughts there?
I can't speak for the Pope and why he treats certain people a certain way. I mean, some of the bishops may have deserved a strong hand. Am I comfortable with the glad handing with liberals and what appear to be deviants, both in the faith and otherwise? No, of course not. But that in no way affects my faith and my understanding about being a member of the church, being a member of a parish with a priest who's in union with his bishop, who's in union with the Pope. Why are we so worried about every little thing the Pope says or does? To me, it's like, isn't your spiritual life complex and challenging enough, right? Why worry about this stuff? Christ is not holding us accountable to make these kinds of judgments. I mean, doesn't that sound a little bit cliche and simple? But to me, Michael, honestly, I know I'm dealing in the apologetics world, but for me, it does boil, and that's why I'm not out there every single day doing this. I really think that we need to double down on our spiritual life and our prayer. I think that's where we're going to gain the merits and the graces. And I can tell you, when these people take the wrong turn, as it appears John Henry Weston has, and many others like him, Taylor Marshalls and the Kennedy Halls, and I'll call all of them out by name, are they ever going to come back and recognize their errors? Well, God willing, they are, but I don't see that. That's extremely, extremely rare. The sedevacantists that I've been fighting for 25 years remain sedevacantists, and they remain even more hardened in their errors and heresies. They don't come back. And I think that's because when you sever the bond of charity, which is exactly what schism does, you're going to be hardened, and God then withdraws grace. It's a frightening prospect.
How many popes in history would have survived the social media influence we see now?
Yeah, all these closet armchair theologians criticizing this, that, and everything. And God love our bishops, but I'll be the first to say we need stronger bishops to speak out on this. And I think it's been a failure on the part of some bishops who have not spoken out. But if we liken this, Michael, to the Passion of Christ, what apostles were speaking out during our Lord's Passion? Okay, so we are dealing with the mystery here. The mystery is not who's a member of the church and who is not, as the sedevacantists claim. That is not a mystery. God didn't set up the membership in the church as a mystery. What's mysterious is how the pillars of the church, the bishops of the church, are not really defending the bride of Christ as she is attacked by her enemies and undergoes this passion. And maybe that's because we deserve that. Maybe we deserve the leaders we get. And that's why I say we got to double and triple down on our own spiritual lives to gain the graces and merits to have these bishops, start defending the faith and priests. That's what we need. Us laymen can only do so much, right?
That's right. That's true. Mahoville says that Kwasniewski wrote that about Vatican I needing an exorcism because he says that Vatican I taught hyperpapalism.
Oh, so
which
now he's challenging Vatican I, not just Vatican II. Is that so?
right, and
Ah,
he understands hyperpapalism to, of course, be that anything the Pope ever says is infallible, which of course is absurd, right?
of course,
Uh,
it's absurd. And what Peter should read is at the end of Pastor Eternus, where he says that it's a matter of divine law that we're subject to his disciplinary decrees and his governance
yeah,
too.
he doesn't
That's
like
what
that.
Peter needs to read, because
He doesn't like that. He ignores it, and he just says that
of
we're
course he
brain
does.
dead if we bring that up.
Of course
Uh,
he does. Where do you go? Where do you go to church, Peter? Are you in union with your bishop?
That's a good question, because he explicitly says that he will not go to the Novus Ordo, and he recommends that others don't go to the Novus Ordo. So if all you have is a Novus Ordo, he says stay at home. He says stay at home because it's inherently impious and sacrilegious, which is the view of the SSPX.
Yes, it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's imbibed the errors. I mean,
Yeah.
look, he's, in my view, a newbie to tradition, and that they all these guys that don't have solid foundations of classical theology have fallen for these errors.
Mm. Thank you for the super sticker here. Fiducia Supcons was written against the liberals. He was trying to bring them mercifully like Christ. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I totally wish that he would have been a little bit more firm in some areas, a little bit more explicit in some areas. But yeah, Fernandez noted it was written against the German bishops. I just feel like it could have been better. It wasn't what people said it was, but I still feel it could have been better.
I
What
agree.
do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Maybe we'll end up getting something that will kind of help balance it out a little bit in the future. We'll see. All right. Well, I think we grabbed everything from the chat there. So thank you so much, Dr. Salza, for coming on and doing this.
Call me John, Michael, anytime. It's a pleasure to serve your viewership, and I look forward to coming back at some point.
I'd love to have you back on. You and also Robert sometime. That'd be nice. That was fun.
Absolutely.
We had both of y'all before. So we'll have to do that again. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you later. God bless.